Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Wednesday Wisdom webinar. Always a bit of a tongue twister, especially at this time on a Wednesday night and this deep into the autumn term. But I'm really glad that you've been able to join us this evening. It's a small group, so there's going to be lots of opportunities to ask questions tonight. As ever, I'd just like to thank Bright Core Consultancy for sponsoring this talk and all of the webinars in this series. Really grateful for their support and for making it possible. If you do get the opportunity to go to their website, it's brightcoreconsultancy.com, and they're brilliant when it comes to safeguarding and mental health in education. Now, this is the third talk in the series. We've had a previous discussion on the art of headship with Russell Spears, and we've also had a KICSI 23 talk with Oliver Welsby. But tonight it's a very, very different tack and approach. Tonight's webinar is going to give you an insight of what it's like to move to an international school, and I'm delighted to welcome Ian Walker, who will be discussing his first-hand experiences of moving from Bradford Grammar School to Dulwich College, Singapore, and then returning back again to the UK. So tonight is a rare opportunity to get insight from somebody who has actually been through the whole process and also happily isn't trying to recruit you either. So he's completely impartial. So you're going to be in very safe hands this evening, and you can be sure of a full and frank talk. So without any further ado, over to you, Ian.
Hello, David, and thank you for the welcome, and welcome to everybody that's on the call. To emphasise what David has said, I'm not here to recruit for an international school. I don't work directly for any international schools anymore, but I had 4 years in Singapore at Dulwich College, which was a thoroughly enjoyable experience. My wife is also a teacher, and we went out there as a teaching couple to give some context to it. But I'll try to share with you the experiences that my colleagues from a variety of different backgrounds, from a variety of different ways that they got into international teaching had as an experience. I'm very happy throughout it. If you've got any questions, please just put them in the chat, and David might jump in and prompt me to take them at that point and answer them as we go through. I just wondered if you could put in the chat why you've signed up for today's session. And I noticed there's a small number of us on the call, so if you could all try to put something into the chat, why you signed up for this session on international schools, to give me a bit of a context and to understand why you are here tonight. Okay, I see about the idea of considering it in the future. Already looking to relocate, interested in teaching internationally. Some of you with experience of already having taught in other countries, but see how it's different now. So we'll context, I don't know how many years ago, but some things may have moved on. Whether you want to take the plunge, which I think is an interesting thing to somebody with also a similar background of a teaching couple, and looking at possibilities. So unsurprisingly, in a lot of your cases, it's because you are thinking about it. So I just wanted to share, first of all, some little thoughts that I put down about reasons as to why you might decide to go overseas. It's not a complete list of all of the things that there might be there, but I want to focus in on some of them to start with, that particularly have come up in my mind, and as David approached me about doing this talk, about things that I picked up from people I've talked to. One up in the top corner is about the number of people I've met who have said, I wish I had taught overseas. People perhaps more towards the end of their teaching career in the UK. And when I've asked them, well, did you apply? Many of them never even got round to the point of actually applying for them. And so one of the reasons I think to go is a lot of people I've met have regretted at a later point that perhaps they didn't even try or find out whether it was right for them. And so out of tonight, one of the things I hope to do is to give you some pointers to work out whether it is the right option for you. I say that from a position that I thoroughly enjoyed the experience, and most of the people that I have met have enjoyed it. But I did also meet people when working in an international scene for 4 years who didn't enjoy the experience, and perhaps because they hadn't had some advice or thought through the process in advance. On the things on there, unashamedly, I think if you ask most international teachers, the actual travel and the new experiences and the adventure are things that have made people do it, and is a very good reason as to why to do it. But it's also worthwhile professionally. I do think that the 4 years teaching overseas was exceptional for my professional development, for my wife's professional development, and afforded us opportunities that we wouldn't have gained by staying within schools within the UK. And that's in the context of having taught both within state schools and independent schools in the UK. Pay, if you make the right move, can be exceptional. Though the right move for you internationally may be to an environment where you're paid a lot less. So pay is important. I'll come back to that throughout the team. And then diversity. There's just so much more opportunity in terms of the range that's available internationally, and the diversity of the team of people you work with and the team of students, I would suggest, is greater than working in any or the most schools in the UK. So I'm going to try and talk through tonight in a sequence of the stages, really, of going towards moving overseas, including the return. I called it the return, but I'll focus more on that towards the end. First of all, just to talk about opportunities and actually applying. I went on TES this week just to have a look. This is the time of year when there's a very large amount of jobs coming up on the international scene, particularly in those countries that teach in the same academic year as ourselves from September through to September. What can be overwhelming, in fact, to start with, is just how many there are. Over 2,000 international teaching jobs on TES for secondary schools alone this week. It's a huge market, huge opportunities with huge variation across it. So one of the things I want to try and everybody take from today's session is you really do have to do some research in advance, particularly if you are entering this with no experience of having taught internationally before. And that research could take as long as a year, because actually, if you were looking at the jobs now, and now is a good time, if you're looking at the jobs now, you might not be in a position to apply in this cycle that is typically recruiting up until Christmas. But you might be able to use that time to narrow down the options that might be suitable for you to be in a position to consider applying in this time in 2024. You do need to do more than just read the adverts on the TS. You are going to have to go onto websites for the different schools. You potentially need to increase your network. And I say that because, as I hope you'll appreciate, there are things I would say to people individually if they spoke to me about particular international schools that I'm not going to say in a context that's shared broadly and wide. So talking to people who've taught in international schools, getting their honest opinions is very important. And that might mean that you want to follow particular schools via LinkedIn, follow teachers that you know, or a colleague that you know that went overseas, perhaps getting back in touch with them, and friends of friends as well to find more information about things. All of this is in the essence that you need to narrow down the opportunities to find out what is right for you to apply for. I think the real danger with, it's true of all jobs, but it's to jump at the first thing that you're offered. We all like to be offered a job. We all like to be successful at interview, but don't take the first offer, and don't take it if it doesn't feel right for you. And so if you've done your research, you're more likely to be applying for the opportunities that could be right for you. And hopefully then you'll be making the right decision. So what I'm going to go through in the next 30 minutes or 25 minutes now probably is about the country, some of the considerations about that, about the school, some of the things that you perhaps want to look at in terms of the school. Some of these hopefully won't be surprising to you, but I'll try to share it from my perspective. About the contract, and I'll be honest here, there were things I didn't really think about when we made the jump, and that we were lucky and fortunate that worked for us. But I'll try and share some anecdotes as to where people perhaps didn't fully understand what they were getting themselves into. I want to focus on the implications of those moving with you, and that's quite broad when we get to that, of who that might affect, and it's different to your own personal circumstances. Talk about leaving the UK, which is part of the process, then the working overseas, but also the return. And I've put an exclamation mark by it because you may not return, and I'll talk more about that as I go through the presentation. Just a reminder before I go on now, go through those sections. If you do feel there's a question on any stage of the presentation that you want to put in the chat, I am very happy to take them at that point. So the international market, by its definition, can take you to a huge variety of countries. And it is really broad. Yes, there is a large chunk of you go on the TS of the jobs that are in the Middle East, that are in Southeast Asia, but actually it could take you all over the world. having been overseas, I've now got friends who are working in South America, that are working in India, that have gone and worked in new emerging markets that perhaps weren't even open 10 years ago. So it really is broad. So thinking about the country is very important. You've got to think about the culture of the country. Is it a culture that's going to suit you to live in? And importantly, you've got to think about it in the context of a culture that you can work in. You're not going on a holiday. And you're not going to change the culture of a country that you are immersed in on the other side of the world. If you are not comfortable working in that environment, in that country, it may not work for you. You perhaps want to think about the safety. It's very different thinking about moving to a country like Indonesia for a holiday, to going and living in Indonesia, particularly with family, if you had younger children and so on. It might be that certain areas of that country are not as safe for you to live the lifestyle that you would want to live with your family. Again, your personal circumstances are different, because there might be points in your life where you're more, you're less, your willingness to take risks might be different, and you might be happier to be in a country that perhaps is not quite as safe, but affords you cultural opportunities that you may not get in a safer country. So to give the example, in my case, we went to Singapore. It was a very deliberate decision that we went to Singapore. I chose Singapore at the stage I was at because I had 2 young children. It was a very safe environment for them to live in. My wife had not worked overseas and had not lived overseas before. It was a good option for me at that point in my life. But I've met teaching colleagues when I've been out there who came to Singapore and actually found it a bit staid. It didn't have the sort of roughness and ready of some of the countries you could go to in Southeast Asia. And some teachers were there for a year or two and moved on because they wanted something that was a little bit different and afforded more of a cultural opportunity. Singapore, though, was fantastic in terms of the fact that you can travel and visit places from there. Really importantly about countries is to think about the cost of living. The salaries obviously are not a fair direct comparison. Earning a certain amount of money in one country might not go as far as earning it in another. So looking at that country to the cost of living, and then in the context when I talk about your contract, is important. Is it going to be a place that you can live the lifestyle you would like to live on the money that you're being offered? Language. It's a consideration. Are you somebody who will be happy to go to a country where, particularly once you're out of the school setting, you do need to learn another language, or at least try to engage with that language? Are you going to be willing to do that? Or are you happy going to a country where the languages that you presently speak? Of course, this is absolutely different for all of you, dependent on which languages you already speak and how confident you are to try to pick up another language. Travel home. Some countries are a lot easier to get back to the UK, and it's not as simple as how far away you are. Singapore, though, a relatively long flight, you could get on a flight tomorrow at any point. And I did have colleagues who regularly, for whatever personal reasons, had to return to the UK or other areas of the world if they're international teachers from other areas of the world, and could easily do that from Singapore. You could pick other countries that are a lot more difficult to make that travel home in those circumstances that you need to. Often not pleasant circumstances, and they could be quite more challenging. So I just finished with that final comment that's on the bottom about you're not looking for a holiday. You've got to be looking at it in terms of the culture and the safety, in terms of a place that you're going to live and work. And that is quite different to thinking about, I visited Thailand on a holiday 4 years ago for 2 weeks, thoroughly enjoyed it. Let's go to Thailand. Thailand might be right for you, but it might not be the right place for you to live. And it all depends on where you are at, and you will know your own context better than anybody else. I've only put that link in on there because I actually took the pictures of the slides from their website. It does have quite a lot of information about different countries, so it is a link that you could go to and find a bit of starting point of information. So the next thing I think you need to consider at the very first stage of thinking about teaching overseas is the type of school you're looking for. Now, this is true, I suppose, when you're applying for any teaching job. Do you want a big school, a small school? Are you if you're looking at jobs in the UK, are you somebody who really wants to work within the state sector? Would you be happy working in the independent sector? But for the things I've already said, the international market is even larger and even more varied. So what are some of the things that you could start by looking at to see whether this is the right type of school for you? Well, large amounts of the international market are now in chains. Do you want to be within one of these major chains of schools? They afford opportunities. It was my experience that there were large numbers of international teachers who, having got into the international system, did move within the chain that they were comfortable within once they'd moved. Some of them afford a lot of opportunity in terms of the training and support that you get when working as a teacher for them, because they operate on that larger scale. To give something an analogy, I suppose it's the difference of perhaps working in a multi-academy trust where there is support across the whole range of schools, compared to working in a small senior school that is standalone. But in the same way, that affords some other differences to them. The nature of them, that large identity across the chain, is that something that you're happy with? If you start getting a feeling for a chain of schools that you're interested in, it would obviously start to narrow all those opportunities that you're seeing on the TS. And then if it's combined with you having made some sensible decisions about the country you're looking at, you might start to be looking at a reasonable number of jobs that is worth you actually applying for, that might be the right fit for you. Importantly, is what type of school it is in terms of whether it's profit or a charitable trust. I worked with Dulwich out there. It is a profit school, and it does bring with it a different culture. One thing I would say is, if you choose to go to work for a school that does try to make a profit, that is run as a business, you have to accept that that's the environment you're going to be working in. I thoroughly enjoyed working for Dulwich. But Dulwich as a school will work you hard because they expect high expectations like any large business. Other schools have a different atmosphere to them, potentially based on their charitable nature or their smaller size. And that's just something to consider. Something I actually didn't think about until we started applying was about curriculum. For me, one of the great things I really appreciate is I actually spent 4 years teaching IB. I hadn't taught IB. There are the opportunities to teach IB within the UK without moving internationally, but it was actually interesting to teach a different curriculum. So it's something that you would look at when you're applying for schools in the UK, but generally speaking, particularly within the state sector, you would be looking at a very similar curriculum. In terms of internationally, there's much more variation that you could choose to in terms of the type of school. Another one is because of the nature of the market, because there are still expanding opportunities out there in the international market, there are also lots of new schools by definition. When I went to Dulwich, it was a new school. It's a different role to go into a completely new school that doesn't know what its school population will be. It's even different to a new school within a city in the UK who effectively might be opening on a territory and taking students from within that existing area. You're going to something that's all fresh, and that can be quite exciting. So if it's something that appeals to you, a new school is a real opportunity to do things differently, to have a real influence over how everything is shaped about that organisation. Equally, a new school doesn't have all those stable systems in place. It does require a lot of work. You will find yourself working long hours. If you're not willing to work long hours in a new startup school, you will live with the fact that things aren't set up. I think it was one of the most exciting things about Dulwich, and one of the things that attracted me to going to it as a school, and I never regretted it, but it did require a lot of hard work. In my case, I went with physics. It was exciting that I knew that as a head of physics, I was arriving as the sole physicist, but I was leaving behind a department of 4 years on in a school that had gone from only primary school students to a full school of 2,500. It's incredible growth in 4 years, and it was something that I really thoroughly enjoyed in terms of a challenge. But it might not be for everybody to go to that environment. They might prefer to go to a school where on the first day those systems are there and you're more supported. And finally, I'd just be cautious of and investigate, and I won't comment on individual examples, about where there are schools that have names that are linked or appear linked to UK private schools. Those links are very, very varied. Some are genuinely close links where you will see staff from the UK-based schools visiting you at the school that you're teaching at internationally, perhaps taking an interest in terms of looking at your school improvement, to others that, to be frank, in some cases seem to have lent their name but have little or nothing to do with the organisation. Just something to be aware of and something to research. And again, it comes back to the networking, perhaps speaking to people who are working at those schools or people that you know that have worked at them. It's going to move on to contract. Again, just a reminder, if there are any questions, please do ask as we're going through. But hopefully I'm working in a logical way through the stages. If you're going to apply internationally, you do need to do some research. The things you really need to think about early on is about the country and about the type of school you're interested in. As you get further into it, you're then going to be offered a contract with whichever school it is that you are successful. Some schools are more open as you are being recruited about the packages that you might be offered. Some keep that very close to their chests until you have been offered the role. And that can make it difficult, like any teaching job, where actually you go for an interview and then you're really expected to make a decision very quickly after that. But you've got to think about the implications of that contract you're being offered. The first thing I'd say about international contracts, and I don't wish to sound patronising on this, but I think it's important because I saw people not fully understand this, is that you are offered a contract for 2 or for 3 years, most typically. It doesn't sit at all naturally with most people's experience of teaching in UK state or independent schools, where frankly you are offered a job, you turn up, and if you do that job well, you will remain at that school. It is a 2 or 3 year contract and dependent on the employment law in the particular country you've gone to, but the general typical experience of most international schools is if at the end of that 2 or 3 years they don't wish to retain you, they won't. You can have made big life decisions to move to somewhere thinking I will be able to stay there for 5, 6, 7 years because I'm doing my job and I'm doing it as I perceive well. But actually, you may not be offered any extension to your contract. And that's not in the context of them downsizing that department. They might be recruiting in a physics teacher to replace you and not even considering you in the next cycle of that. I do know of people who took international contracts of 2 or 3 years, 2-year contract, for instance, at the start of their second year, returning in the September, 2 weeks in, they were told in a conversation very directly and very matter of fact that they would not be being offered an extension beyond that year, which, having uprooted yourself to somewhere else in the world, thinking you might be able to stay there, you've perhaps even settled, enjoyed it, and are enjoying the job, it's quite a surprise to some of them that there wasn't going to be any opportunity to extend their employment and to have to start looking. So I have perhaps laboured on that point, but I think it's so fundamentally different to essentially moving in a school in the UK in that context. Pay. Obviously, you need to consider about exchange rates, and you need to consider it in the context of the cost of living for that country. Is the money that you're offering going to be enough to live on? This does require some quite deep research. I was lucky, to be honest. The package that I was offered turned out to be good, but I literally left the interview, and if this is where I can share perhaps me not getting everything right, but it worked well for us, is I left the interview not knowing whether the pay I'd been offered was enough. Did a few calculations, looked up a few things online that I probably should have looked up earlier, thought this will work, went with it, and it did work. I was also benefited quite largely from the fact that I made the decision, and within 6 months of having made that decision, the exchange rate changed in my favour, which politically might not be very pleasant to everybody else, but because of Brexit. So I took the job, and then suddenly the money I was earning in Singapore in terms of my UK costs became worth considerably more due to the change in the exchange rate, something I wouldn't have known at the time I took the job. Next thing in terms of thinking about a contract, I think you need to be honest about the likely lifestyle you'll lead. Putting my personal context on that, I'm up in Yorkshire. I don't live a very city-based life with all of the attractions that a big city can have. But I did see people go out internationally who decided once they were there to take up on all of the things that a city can offer. But suddenly they start spending considerably more money than they were spending in the UK. So all of their ideas about how far their money would go did not quite match up, because the lifestyle that they lived, having moved to the new environment, was costing them a lot more money than perhaps their lifestyle in a different setting had been. So I think you've got to be honest to yourself about how you'll live in that country in the context of the cost of living, and how do you want to live that, and does it work for you? Obviously, all different depending on your personal circumstances. Really importantly, because it can be where the big differences are, is to look at the benefits involved with the job. How is your accommodation structured? Is it that you're provided with accommodation, which can be true of some international schools? Is it that you are given a certain budget and you look for your accommodation? Is it that you have to spend all of that amount that you're given for accommodation on the accommodation, or if you don't spend all of it, you can keep the extra amount of money that is within your accommodation rates that they're giving you? Flights in the same way. Is it that you are allowed so many flights to a certain destination each year? Is it a certain amount of money that you are given that you can spend on any flights? And how does that work? Education. This is only applicable if you have somebody within the context of your family that's moving that will be required to be in education. Is there free education through the school that you're moving to, or is it that you're going to have to find education for them in the country and you're going to have to pay for that? Quite important to check. And can be some assumptions made by people that there will be free education for children of theirs. Particularly some people who move with very young children and hadn't thought about 1 or 2 years in, and their child now starts to be of school age, would they have a free place within the school that they've moved to? And medical. What sort of medical package do you have? And if it's not within your benefits, how are you going to ensure that you have the medical cover that you wish to have when you're overseas in the particular country that you're in? And will that involve large costs that you need to plan for? It's probably obvious, but if you are in state school in the UK at the moment, you'll be on a teacher's pension. You clearly are not going to get any of that through international schools. And so all the context of thinking about the higher salaries, which in many countries you are getting considerably more than you might be paid in the UK, is within the context that you're not paying into the teacher's pension scheme. And it's probably worth you looking at where you are with your teacher's pension and things on that. Right, I'm probably going to come to that question, David, about selling, renting house on the next slide. So I'll go along with that. But that's sort of the contract side of it. So if you've got to this point, you've been given the contract because you've been successful at interview and you've got the job. The final sort of thing I suppose to think about is about some of the implications of those people moving with you. I was reminded today, only after writing this slide, that the implications of the people who are moving with you can be really quite broad. When I spoke to one of my international colleagues this morning and said, what was one of the most difficult things you found when moving? And he said, moving my dog. And I went, yes, you did. You flew your dog out to Singapore. I didn't actually think about that because it wasn't something I'd done, but he wasn't leaving his dog in the UK, and he did look into how he would be able to move his dog out to Singapore. So the people have got lots of things of implications of who of those that you're moving with you. I think it's quite important to do a bit of research alongside looking at the country and where you're thinking of applying about whether some of the things you really still enjoy are available. On the photos on the left, I don't play netball. My wife is in amongst those photos. Netball was a really big part of her life before we moved. And knowing that that's something she could join in with as soon as she got to the country and make connections with a group of similar-minded people was really quite important. In the context that she hadn't lived overseas before, it brought her into experience to meeting people outside of the school who were in Singapore for a whole variety of reasons by keeping up with something that she was already interested in the UK. So I think it's important to look at whether things that you're interested in, hobbies and interests, are there. I think it's important to think about in some detail about the implications of the distance from your present family and friends. That doesn't mean it has to be a barrier to moving, but you might want to think about some of the things that you will do, how you can support some of the needs of the people that are moving with you in terms of them being further away from family and friends. Certainly one of the things we did was quite a lot of work with grandparents to make them happier. This was pre-COVID, so they hadn't had the experience of doing things like this and going online so that they could talk to their grandkids when they moved to the other side of the world. But doing that in the time before you move by having thought about it, because you're going to be very busy when you arrive there. Really importantly here, if you're not a teaching couple, though this then does touch on a teaching couple as well in the second bit I'm going to talk about, is about your partner, if you're moving with a partner, their ability to work in the country. Some people that we did meet working internationally had made assumptions about countries that they were going to, about their partner's ability to get work when they got to the country. And that can be a huge strain on relationships and a huge issue in terms of them settling and finding things that they wish to be involved with. So looking at the situation for both of you in terms of the work that you might do out there is important. Another one is about, and this particularly happened with teaching couples, is about understanding the difference that if you are employed once you are there, you will be employed on a very different contract. As teachers from international, employed from overseas, you are given that international contract. Quite a few of the people we worked with, their partners as teachers moved on the semi-promise that there would be something available soon. And in many cases, there was something available at the school they'd moved to very soon after they arrived. But of course, the terms and conditions under which their partners were then employed by the school were not the same as theirs. And so it's an important point to think about. One tactical decision that my wife Emily and I did decide to do before we moved was we didn't apply for any jobs where there wasn't an advertised opportunity at the time, or we confirmed in advance of going to interview for both of us. And I was very blunt, rightly or wrongly, to say to the schools that we showed an interest in and to Dulwich that then did employ us that they were going to be employing both of us or neither of us. I didn't even give them the option of returning the outcome that we would like to employ Emily, but they didn't want to employ me. And I thought that was quite important because we arrived there then both having given up our work within the UK, knowing that we were arriving into employment that we were both happy with. So I was very upfront and honest about that. I did see people who edged their bets, if you want to call it, on that, and hoped that there would be work when they got there. Sometimes it worked out well for them, sometimes it didn't. So it's just something I'd advise. So hopefully that's getting you to think about some of the implications of people you're moving with. And at the top about culture and safety, I sort of touched on it when you look at a country, but there is a danger perhaps that you make the decisions about the culture and safety based on what works for you, but not thinking about the people that you are moving to the other side of the world with. Okay, I suppose this is, David, where I will touch on about selling and renting your house and things. Leaving the UK, first of all, if it's not exciting, you probably attended this talk and made the wrong decision in terms of going for it. It should be an exciting experience to go to live on the other side of the world. There should be a real buzz about it. You also invariably end up with a very long time to think about it. We were given our job offers in the late November, early December, only to be then moving out in the August of the following year. It does mean that you can use that time incredibly well to make sure your move goes well. But equally, it does mean that you've got a long time left in your present employment. And one first thing I'd suggest is that you have a strategy of how you're going to continue to be the good teacher that you are at the school that you're at for the time that you have remaining, and be very deliberate about what you want to achieve in that time early on, because it's a long time to be sat in meetings knowing that all the things that they're talking about, you will have gone by the time they're implemented. And it's much longer than is typically true for teaching. One important thing to think about is different school years. This particularly affected, in my experience, people with state schools, because generally they have shorter school holidays, is sometimes having accepted their contract and realised everything, in the year that they're leaving the UK, they found that they got little or no holiday at all. Generally, particularly if you're in the international schools in Southeast Asia or the Middle East, you will find that the school year might start quite a bit earlier. they're really important to look at that in terms of the holidays and also the pay, because if you have a break in school years, there is actually the potential on either way in moving that you have a month without pay, and actually that tends to happen more on returning to the UK. So I'll touch on that on returning. Renting out a property in the UK, my personal opinion is, unless you know you're leaving the country and you're definitely not going to be coming back, I generally experience people that they rented their properties out rather than selling them. I'm no financial advisor, so don't take me on all of this. You could time it well. House prices could drop, but actually keeping in the situation where you've got a property to return to the UK if you already have one is probably the better option. It does mean you then need to think about the management options of it. Are you going to use a management company to rent your property out? Is there a friends or family that you could do that through? What I did encounter was some people who tried to do a let themselves, avoiding management companies, and then having huge issues which cause them stress from the other side of the world. So it's just something to think about. What will work for you, and can you manage that property having rented it out? For us, it worked definitely as the best option because we did return to the UK, and I am very glad that we held on to our property in the UK for the 4 years that we were away. Financially, it was good, and I think it was also good in terms of keeping that UK footprint, which is the next part. You might want to think a long way ahead on this, but it's actually quite important to have a UK footprint for a whole variety of reasons. So if you own a property, that does help you to keep a footprint in the UK. Being on the electoral register, it's a very simple thing, but it keeps you rights, apart from anything else, to vote in general elections. But I advise trying to keep that footprint. It did affect some people who moved out with older children, who then started to realise that with no UK footprint, they were really struggling in terms of university applications and in terms of them being considered as not being overseas students, and hence considerably larger university fees. Whereas where people had more of a UK footprint, it was easier in those circumstances. That in itself probably is an hour-long presentation about the implications of university, but it's something to think about. And if in doubt, I would suggest keep that footprint in the UK. Tax, I've seen people fall really foul of this at both ends. It's your responsibility to sort it out. It is not the school that you're going to work for, wherever it is. So you do need to do whatever is right in terms of your tax situation to inform at the UK end, and to make sure that you comply with the tax situation in the country that you go to. So it's something that from very early on you should be looking at. One thing I would do with the time that you've got before leaving the UK is make sure that you reassure your family in the UK about the move, that you spend time talking to them about things. You don't really want them to be raising some issues that they've got about you moving, but as you arrive in the other country or just as you're getting on the plane. So, we managed to do some really good things in that time that reassured family. It came as a bit of a surprise to them. We hadn't announced to all of them that we were applying for international jobs, but by talking to them in the time that we had, it worked really well for us. Before you go, you need to research where you're going to live. You've got loads of time to do it. I literally had the biggest spreadsheet of properties in Singapore. I had worked out exactly where I wanted to live. I hadn't actually told Emily that I'd absolutely decided, and we ended up living more or less exactly where I had on my spreadsheet before I went. But it gave us the option to get off the plane and start looking at properties in the areas that would work in terms of a commute to work in terms of access to transport and other things. So I put a considerable amount of work into that, and I think it was very worthwhile. It worked out well for us both financially, but also in terms of we thoroughly enjoyed the place that we lived in for the whole 4 years we were there. Use the time between being offered the job to talk to people already there. A good international school will link you up almost with a buddy who's there already, perhaps with similar circumstances to you, and you could talk to them about things that they've got, and that can work incredibly well. And then finally, and I did see people fall foul of this, is that they hadn't got far enough ahead in the time they had from the November, December when they're offered. They got to the end of the school year, everything was getting on top of them. They rushed around all summer, and they arrived in the biggest, newest job that they've ever had on the other side of the world, absolutely worn out. We took a break. We took a short holiday, and it was very worthwhile, because once you land in this new foreign country, wherever it is, and you start in a new job, you are going to be so busy. And as any teacher knows, it's a long term from September through to Christmas at the best of times. You don't want to be arriving for that tired. So make sure at some point in that leaving the UK period, you give yourself some time to arrive fresh and ready for a new challenge and the excitement that's ahead. Just coming back to tax, I've got some of the questions in here. I'll go back and mention a little bit about interview process at this point. I've got a question about tax. Essentially, you need to look at it by each separate country. It's very, very different. So it is your responsibility to look into that. It falls with the sort of networking of talking to people who are already there about the implications of it. So in terms of the UK tax, it depends on the relationship between the country you're going to and its relationships with HMRC in the UK. Generally speaking, to the more well-known destinations of the Middle East and Singapore, unless you do something wrong in terms of informing the taxman at both ends, you end up financially better off in terms of the tax. Obviously, it all depends on your circumstance. If your partner has a UK income or UK businesses, your circumstances will be very different to somebody else. And so tax is an individual responsibility. I suppose my most direct answer to that, and I think it's Josh who's asked this question, is you probably, if in doubt, should make sure that you get some financial advice from somebody who's qualified from an accountant. And what you shouldn't do is believe that it is the school that you're going to's responsibility to sort out your tax affairs. It's not. And teachers can be in very diverse situations because of family setups and how they earn income. I had UK income from a rental property. That makes it different to somebody who has no UK income when they're away. So it is important that you get the right information for yourself. I'm sorry, I can't answer it in more detail than that. I can't give you my Singapore property spreadsheet. It's also now will be 7 years out of date, but it definitely is worth doing. But what I can say is that Google Maps is fantastic for, looking at where everything is, working it all out, and even down to the level of, which number bus can I get into school you can do. Supported also, I have to say, I had one contact that they put me in touch with out there who was able to give me advice. I also, in the period that before we went out, got in touch through my old school network. I got in touch with two people who were working out there outside of education who were able to afford me advice. So it's my big take out of this slide is use that time that you will have to do some planning to make your arrival as efficient as possible, and also so that you arrive less stressed because you're about to start a big new job. Unless there's any questions at this point further, and I haven't missed any, David, I'm going to skip on to the next slide. It says, working overseas might sound weird talking about the whole thing of moving overseas. I'm not actually going to spend too long talking about working overseas because I think hopefully this has come across in the flavour of it is the context will be very different depending on where you are. So I tried to think about some of the things that are true across all of it, and particularly from where you're talking to people who are experienced international teachers, where they perhaps pointed out colleagues who hadn't made the step into working overseas very well. And I think one of the most important things is embrace new ideas of working and ways of working. In the UK, even if you move from one of the most expensive private independent schools to another independent school, the change is not as large, and the way they're working is probably not as considerable as it potentially is working internationally. You end up with a very diverse team, but they all bring different experiences of whether they've worked in the States or whether they've worked in Australia, whether they have been international for years, whether they've taught IB, whether they've taught A-level. So many great ideas, but still you get the odd person who goes to work overseas and sort of gives them the well, this was how we did it in my multi-academy trust in the UK, and this is the right way. And that doesn't fit well for me in terms of you settling into working overseas. You've got to embrace that more diverse team. It's one of the reasons to move, but it also means that you need to think about how you work. Be really open to listen to new ideas. It will surprise you that there are things that you hadn't perhaps thought about, or that you're not exposed to in your professional development in the UK environment, where there's a danger of not as many voices represented there. Try not to have preconceptions about the cultures that you're going to. Again, on every level, learn from the people, embrace the country that you're in, and you will get the most out of the opportunity. It is fantastic to go live in another country if you get to know them. But we did have people come to work out with us in Singapore who didn't settle. They didn't embrace the differences of another country. And it is somebody else's country when you're there. And my advice is that you embrace it and you enjoy that experience. And one other thing I say about working overseas is do share that experience with your family and friends. One of the greatest things of our 4-year period overseas was that friends of ours from the UK came out to visit us, and family that had never travelled beyond Portugal went to the other side of the world and came out to Singapore. And I think that was a fantastic experience, and it made it all the richer for us and also for our much wider family. And it also means that now when I meet up back with them in the UK, I can talk to them about the experiences that we had out there. And that's on a personal level, that's been really fantastic. Before I talk about the return, David, is there anything you think I've missed? And equally anybody else, if there's any questions I missed in the chat, I don't know if I have, and then I'll talk a bit about the return. Okay.
Very comprehensive, Ian, so far, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so the return. First of all, will it happen? I met some remarkable people out there in Singapore who'd actually been on the international circuit, having moved internationally for over 25 years, went for a bit of an experience at 20 years old. They were more my age when I was working with them by that point, had worked in 5-6 different countries. They never actually returned. They may have moved on from the school that they went to, that first application and with that first interview process, but they didn't actually return. So will it happen? It might not. There is a real danger with it, and I think particularly in a country like Singapore, where even the non-teachers tend to be expats with a limited time that they're there, is you can become obsessive that the whole conversation becomes about, are you staying another year? It's something I'd guard you against, but it perhaps does mean that somewhere in your own mind, you've got to be comfortable in answering those questions with everybody, because people do seem to pick. They're always trying to find out if you're staying longer. I'd advise against that and trying to enjoy the time that you're there, but it is something that's probably always there in your mind. There's a real network of international teachers, and what I would say is that in your return or you're moving on to another international opportunity, one of the things that you will be better placed as a result of is knowing international teachers who've already made that return. So certainly one of the things you can do is you'll see people who will go back to the UK in the time that you're working out there. What things did they have to consider? Also, where have they gone to work? How have they found that move back, and so on? But equally, that's a whole network that opens up for other international opportunities and a much more informed approach than the first time you apply overseas to look at other international countries. And in that sense, I still keep in touch with lots of my friends who are teaching internationally. Many have moved on from Singapore now, because I don't rule out that we would look to do an international move at another point. A key message I wanted to get into tonight is I actually think the return is the hard bit. The moving out was the exciting bit. Coming back to the UK in particular, rather than moving on to another international job, it can be a very, very difficult process. One of the things is the timeframes on it. If you are going to return to the UK, you've got to give notice, and the notice period that you have to give is very large. And so essentially, in about October or November, you've made the decision that you are returning to the UK. But if you are returning to the UK, you probably can't apply for many jobs that are coming up in September. So it is a leap of faith. You make an early decision, and you then have to stick with that. And in that sense, it can be quite stressful. And you, in the same way as when you moved out of the UK, you've got a long time to think about this. But in this case, without any idea of where you're moving to next. And that's something to really think about in terms of moving internationally, and to be aware that at some point you will have to go through that process. I think it's why many of my international teaching friends have stayed international and not returned. It can be costly. It certainly was more costly for us to return to the UK than to move out to Singapore. I don't think you can guarantee that all of your experience, however diverse it's been, is valued by all of the schools in the UK. It possibly is as variable as who they have on their staff and their SLT, and what their personal sort of preconceptions of somebody who's worked overseas are, and what they might bring to the team back in the UK, that some schools don't seem to value that in the same way. And that certainly shows up in terms of people not getting interviews in some cases that surprise you or don't, and so on. And it's difficult because you leave a new life that you've been accustomed to. We left Singapore. That meant we no longer had a helper. We had to go back to actually doing our own washing and our own ironing and other such things that were real benefits of living on the other side of the world. And so some of those is more tricky. And when you're returning to UK, if you turn up at a school in England, they don't see it as a big thing that they've got a new member of staff on the first day. You're perhaps not welcomed in the same way that you've come from the other side of the world. Whereas when you move internationally, people know that you've got off a plane. They've done that themselves. And actually, I found on the whole that they were very welcoming to somebody who's made a big life move. When you make the big life move back to the UK, people just assume you're starting a new job, and you don't get the same support necessarily. And one thing I've certainly seen from quite a few teachers is that where they've decided on a return, some of them have deliberately taken a gap year in a whole variety of different ways. And essentially, when we came back, I did that. We moved back around Emily's job. We found it far too difficult for both of us to be applying for jobs. And I knew that my plan of you take both of us saying to UK schools was never going to work. And so I decided I would look for work having got back and have a bit of a gap and change some of the things I'm doing. So I was still working around education, but I'm not in full-time employment in schools and haven't been in the 4 years that we're back. So that's a lot of the things I want to cover. What I didn't mention about was about interviews. One thing I'll say about international schools is they're much more open to interviews being done online. Some schools, where they're trying to save money in some cases, will do the whole process online. But that might involve you still teaching a part of a lesson. So very similar in that sense to the UK process. Some of the bigger schools, what they actually do is they send back members of their SLT to the UK. So when I was interviewed for Dulwich, we were interviewed at Dulwich in London, and they do a big transfer recruitment where they have got members of their senior leadership team back in the UK doing that recruitment. What often happens, though, is before that stage is that you will have some form of a Zoom meeting, initial chat, so that they can come down to a short list that they will actually interview, whether that then is in subsequent Zoom type meetings or in person where they travel to the countries where they want to recruit. I hope that answers that question in terms of that. In summary, for me, we are so happy as a family that we went internationally. I had a colleague of mine who had retired by the time he visited us out there, and he said, "Ian, I wish I'd done this." And that's one thing I would like to hold you is at least look at it as an option and work out whether it is the right thing for you with your circumstances, how it'll impact your family and your friends and so on. But do look at it, because there's a real danger you don't at all, because actually the opportunities are so diverse that without spending some time doing some research, you might just not get there. And I do meet many people who just never got round to really putting the application in. I hope that's been of help, David, to everybody that's on the call. I'm very happy to take questions from anybody. I think I've gone slightly over my time.